A lot of them burnt to death. Actually, more probably died in hiding in the cellars of carbon monoxide poisoning from the fires or from the heat. They couldn't get out into the fire, so they basically baked in the cellars, or all the oxygen ran out and they suffocated.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name's Oliver Webb Carter and I'm the editor, and I'm afraid that was quite a morbid start to the podcast this week. And today we're talking about the bombing of Hamburg in 1943 with Keith Lowe, the author of the book Inferno. So Keith talks about this, well, it's not a fun subject, and it is an important subject though, because we don't often talk about the bad side of what the Allies did during World War II. I say bad side, but certainly, the side of things where we talk about the good and the bad war of World War II. And it was undoubtedly a good war, but did everything that happened during it on the Allied side, was that all good? And that's the subject of Keith's book, Inferno, and that's what we talk about. And it's one of those nuanced questions, as many things are when looking at the past. So there's no right or wrong. It's just complicated and difficult. And Keith describes the bombing and why it happened. We then go on and talk about how we bombed the British, the Allies, the RAF, the Americans, bombed France and Holland as well, so our own, people we were liberating. And then we talk a little bit about the impact of World War II on Europe and how it was in a completely chaotic state immediately after the war ended. So it's an interesting talk with Keith. He's written some fantastic books. I've put the links in the show notes, so I really do recommend it. I mean, Inferno on Hamburg is fascinating, but also his other books, the Europe in the Aftermath of World War II, it's called Savage Continent, highly recommended. A couple of things to cover back at Aspects of History HQ. We got a couple of articles that I think will be really interesting. They're all World War II related. I guess that continues the theme from our discussion today, but if you're interested, we've got a really nice piece from Dilip Sarkar, who's written a book on Douglas Bader. Never sure how to pronounce it. Pretty sure it's Bader. He was the RAF ace who shot down around 22 German fighters in World War II, and he didn't have any legs. He lost his legs in a plane crash in the 1930s. And Dilip has written a piece about the controversy surrounding a piece of sort of RAF tactics. Now, go with me on this. It doesn't sound that interesting, but it is interesting. It should sound interesting because it is, in that there was this sort of theory around strategy in fighting the Germans during World War II, during the Battle of Britain, that Douglas Bader got involved in, and it went right to the top. Lots of people got sacked, and it went to the Downing Street as well. So Dilip writes about that controversy. He's written a new book, so it looks really interesting. And we've also got a piece from John Lucas, who's written about a woman who had an affair with Heinrich Himmler. Now, I don't know about you, that gives me the shivers. That Heinrich Himmler is not the most attractive person who ever walked the earth. He's probably the most, or one of the most unattractive people to ever walk the earth. Well, she had an affair with him, and why did she do that? Well, it's a murky story, but it does seem as though there was an honourable motivation behind it, in that she had a son from her first marriage who was Jewish and was trying to protect him. So worth reading about that as well. He's written a really interesting book about that. Elsewhere, I mentioned it before, I'm going to mention it again. It's the Unpublished Historical Fiction Award, the Aspects of History Unpublished Historical Fiction Award. Prize, £500. And the book gets published. It's only a tenner to enter. And with that tenner's entry, you receive a discount code of 50% off an annual subscription of Aspects of History. So you pay a tenner, but you basically get a fiver back, so a fiver entry. So if you know anyone who's written a novel, as they always say, you have a book inside you. Everyone has a book inside them. And that's where it should stay. That's what Christopher Hitchens said. I didn't say that. That's not my thinking. Anyway, over to the podcast. As ever, you can get hold of me on the Twitter at OllieWCQ, OLLIEWCQ. And I will pass you over to Keith and me talking about the bombing of Hamburg in 1943. Now, this kind of leads us slightly into your next book, which is there is a monument, I think, to the victims of the Hamburg bombing. Is that correct in your book?
There is, yes.
So this is a bombing that I don't think, and I know you've written this in your book Inferno, that when people think about the Allies bombing Germany during the war, it's Dresden is the one that is always brought up, and probably rightly so. But Hamburg, I think, had just as many, if not more, and predominantly, I mean, if not all civilians, or the vast majority of civilians, nearly 40,000, I think. Now, this was your next book, Inferno, or your, well, it's not your next book. Was it your first book in 2007?
That was my first book, yes.
So why did you want to write about, I have a suspicion I know, but why did you want to write about the bombing of Hamburg in 1943?
Well, it's several reasons. I mean, books about bombing, I think bombing is our sort of weak point in Britain. We like to think of ourselves as the heroes of the war, and we were, to a large extent, us and the Americans and even the Russians, we were liberating Europe. It was a good thing we did, but the way we went about it was not, that's where the sort of problems begin, because bombing civilians is certainly controversial. And you've got to remember, actually, that we didn't only bomb civilians in Germany, we also bombed them in France and in Holland, and they're supposed to be our allies. We're supposed to be liberating them.
Is it 40,000 French killed? Is that right, in Allied bombing?
Yeah, I think it's even more. I think it was about 60.
Right.
Yeah, between 40 and 60,000 French civilians killed by our bombs. So yeah,
these are huge numbers. They really are.
It is. So I think it's important to put your finger on the weak spots every now and then, and just say, okay, it's very easy to just push this to one side and pretend it's not happening, but actually let's look at it, full in the face and see where we come out. And I chose Hamburg specifically because it wasn't Dresden, and I wanted people to remember that there's lots of other bombings going on, and as you say, Hamburg was twice as bad as Dresden was. So if you're thinking about body counts and so on, we should be looking in 1943, not in 1945. The other thing that's interesting about Hamburg is I think it's very easy just to sort of flip the coin over. It's very easy to be sort of apologetic about Dresden, because that was the time when, really by the end of the war, we had air supremacy. There was nobody, the German Air Force weren't really fighting back nearly as much. We had all kinds of other tactics we could have been using instead of just blitzing whole cities, and yet we didn't. So that's sort of, we're kind of right to feel guilty about that. But Hamburg's a bit more difficult, because that's at the point of the war where we're not winning. We don't have air supremacy. Actually, the Germans are shooting us out of the sky, left, right, and centre. So, it's much more of a battle. So that it becomes much more interesting thinking about the morality of it. Sure, we're bombing women and children. That's awful. But on the other hand, we've got no other way of fighting the war, and shouldn't we be doing something, but rather than doing nothing? And if this is the only way we can do it, then maybe that's justified. So it's a much more murky story. And it's those murky stories that I enjoy going into. It's much more interesting, I think.
Yeah, I can definitely tell throughout your books that it's really interesting. So were there any moral qualms at the time amongst the military leaders or the political leaders for the bombing of Hamburg?
There were a few. Yeah, there were one or two Labour MPs who argued against it. Religious figures as well. The Bishop George Bell, he stood up in the House of Lords and argued against it, saying that we're making ourselves as bad as them by doing this. We shouldn't be doing this. But on the whole, in 1943, most people supported it because, as I said, there seemed to be no other way of waging the war at that point. We didn't have a foothold on the mainland of Europe, so that was all we could do. So we had to be doing it.
And to the way the bombing was carried out, it was most effective because I think all the stars were aligned for the RAF when they went in. It was predominantly the RAF, wasn't it? But the Americans weren't bombing by then.
The Americans bombed during the day, but in smaller numbers, trying to specifically target very small bits of the port, and missed them, unfortunately. Whereas the British went in at night with much larger force and just dropped bombs on everything. And their predominant idea was not to blow things up. They wanted to set fire to things. So they dropped
the incendiary bombs. Is that?
Yeah. So the reason they dropped high explosives was just to blow the windows out and to knock the roofs off, in order to let the air get in, so that when they dropped the incendiaries afterwards, that it had oxygen to feed the fires. I mean, it was all about setting fire to cities. It's quite brutal when you think about it, but it's the most effective way of destroying a city, is to set fire to it.
And so the intention was to destroy the city.
Yeah, well, to destroy. The sort of technical jargon was to dehouse the population, the working population, who then would not be able to work in the factories and so on. But effectively, you're setting fire to a whole city, and if the people are burning to death, that's part of the job. So
and sort of nearly 40,000 are killed in this. Now, does that mean that this is pretty morbid stuff? But were this was burnt to death as you've described through these incendiary devices?
Yeah, a lot of them burnt to death. Actually, more probably died hiding in the cellars of carbon monoxide poisoning from the fires or from the heat. They couldn't get out into the fire, so they basically baked in the cellars, or all the oxygen ran out and they suffocated. So they found sort of piles of bodies heaped up in these cellars afterwards. So it's quite gruesome, really. The cleanup operation I also covered up in the book, which, of course, they went to the local concentration camp and pulled out all the Jewish workers to come and do it for them, because it was quite gruesome, horrible work, and they didn't want to get their hands dirty. That's not particularly praiseworthy either from their side. This is what war's about. War is not a nice thing ever.
Yeah, war is hell. I mean, it links back to one of the statues you've written about in your latest book, the Bomber Command one, which is another very controversial one, because it's for the 50-odd thousand airmen who lost their lives in bombing raids in the war, but there's no mention at all of any of the victims of that bombing.
I mean, there actually is a mention, which was sort of added as an afterthought after a lot of arguing by historians, and was put right at the top, sort of behind, so you can't really see it unless you crane your neck and know where it is and are looking for it. It's that's my one problem with that monument. It's I'm talking about the Bomber Command
The Bomber
Memorial
Command one, yeah,
in Green Park, in
yeah.
London. I mean, it's quite a sort of traditional looking statue of an air crew standing there, having just come out of a plane, having finished their bombing raid. But they're not really doing anything. They're just sort of standing and sort of looking square-jawed off into the distance, And if you compare that to the memorial to the fighter pilots on the embankment, that's much more full of action. It's people running off to jump in their planes and defend Britain in the Battle of Britain and so on. That's very sort of kinetic feeling. Whereas the Bomber Command one, that nobody's doing anything. They're just sort of standing there looking heroic. And the reason why they're not doing anything is because the actual action of what they're doing is problematic. So you don't want to show it in a memorial to your dead airmen. You sort of leave it somewhere at the back, at the top, as a sort of footnote.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, that one. Well, they all are, I suppose. But I mean,
they could have done it differently. They could have done it, made it more of a sort of a monument to how horrible war is, and say something like, look what we had to do. We had to do these terrible things because we were at war. This war is awful, and it even makes us, the heroes, do things which are problematic. That would be much more interesting rather than trying to pretend it hadn't happened.
Yeah, I mean, there is an argument. There's certainly an argument that many distinguished historians would make that the bombing campaign was necessary, and as horrific as it was, it had to be done. It was total war. So I think even the most pro-bombing campaign historian would acknowledge the moral difficulties with it. It's not an easy answer. Yeah. So one other one I wanted to mention, which I've always found a bit. I love animals and everything. I'm not an animal hater, but there's a monument to the animals who've died in war. And that's really a monument for us, because the animals obviously aren't going to appreciate that.
Yeah. We're a nation of animal lovers, aren't we? So
well, yes, we are. We're speaking as a football has just been discovered. Yes. We won't go into that. Don't worry, Keith.
We won't go into that. I'm not a West Ham supporter, so I feel safe.
me neither. But yeah, well, I guess, are there any? I just don't know if there are any other countries that would put up a monument. It's quite a big monument, the one to the animals. It's on Park Lane, isn't it?
Park. By Park Lane. It's I can think of others. For example, in Japan, in the center of Japan, near the Yasukuni Shrine, which I also cover in the book, they've got a statue to horses and dogs and pigeons. There's a pigeon statue, because of course carrier pigeons were used during various wars. So those are commemorated there in the same way that we commemorate our animals of warfare. It's a nice thing, I think.
It's quite sweet, yeah, I suppose. Yeah. I'm unconvinced, I gotta say, Keith.
Well, it's just good to remember that we have used animals to do our dirty work quite a lot of them. They don't have a choice. We're making them do it, and it's good to just acknowledge that. That's all.
Yes, you're right. Now, so another book that you've written that is that's also, I think, explores an area that not many people and not many other historians have, is Savage Continent. So this is Europe in the immediate aftermath of the war. I think it's from 44 to 49 you've covered. And for most people, their knowledge of Europe after the war was, Marshall Plan comes in, loads of American dollars, happy days, everything gets better. But that's not the reality, is it?
No, unfortunately. I mean, this is another example where, I like to, you have this thing called the Second World War, and then you have this other thing called the Cold War. But there's a bit in between that very rarely gets talked about, where everything's in chaos and nobody knows what's going on, and there's all kinds of revenge taking place, and that's it's the in-between bits I like to go for. Those are the interesting. That's where the stories happen. That's where you're changing from one vision of the world into a different vision of the world. That's where it's all happening, in that in-between bit. So yes, the Europe in between sort of 44 and 49 was in a state of chaos. I mean, you can imagine whole cities have been destroyed. There's nowhere for people to live. That 35 million people at least have been killed during the war. So everybody's grieving, everybody's sort of traumatized, and there's a whole communities of people who are out for revenge. They want someone to pay for this, and they're incensed by what's happened, what's been done to them. So that's really interesting. What do they do? Who do they target? Who do they take their anger out on? And how do they survive? There's all the institutions that they had known have been destroyed, and the new ones haven't quite been set up yet. So what do they do in the meantime? These are the interesting questions, I think.
No governments, no law, no legal system, no police forces. Yeah. It really, as you say, it's chaos, isn't it? I mean, I was reading. You cover the Greek Civil War, I think, in that book, and I think there's a stage where there are British soldiers fighting on one side of the Greek Civil War against anti-German Greek fighters. Obviously, the civil war involved communists on one side, and it was right versus left. But it's just this bizarre situation, the Greek Civil War, which Churchill, I think, was he very keen on. Obviously, he wanted Greece to be, no way would it ever go communist. And that's why he put troops in.
Absolutely. I mean, he was a big supporter of the bringing back. He wanted to bring back kings everywhere. So the whole idea of communists taking over was abhorrent to him. And he actually he sat down with Stalin before the Greek Civil War and made a sort of secret deal with him that Greece would be in the British sphere of influence, and places like Poland and Eastern Europe would be firmly in the Soviet sphere of influence, and we wouldn't interfere with them if they didn't interfere with us. And to be fair, Stalin kept to his side of the agreement. He could quite easily have sent in partisans from neighboring Albania and Yugoslavia and so on, and sent people down in to join the Greek partisans and try and overthrow I shudder I sort of hesitate to call them Democrats, because a lot of the people the communists were fighting against were sort of quite fascistic. Yeah,
it wasn't good versus evil.
No, exactly. I mean, it's before the Greek Civil War, during the war itself, that all the partisans were having a sort of fight between themselves, where the communists were trying to take over from the nationalist partisans. But then you got the Greek collaborators with Germany and Italy, who are kind of in control. And then the British turn up, and they don't really want to allow the communists to take over, so they prop up the fascist collaborators, which is sort of problematic, really. What are we fighting for if we're not allowing these people to be properly dealt with after the war? Having said that, of course, the communists were pretty brutal themselves. I mean, they weren't shrinking violets by any stretch of the imagination. They were quite happy to massacre whole populations themselves.
So yeah, it's a story that is definitely should be. I'll obviously put a link to this book in there, because it's a story that is so interesting and not as well known as it should be. And then, so I wanted to. We're getting towards the end of our discussion, Keith, and I wanted to talk a bit about Fear and Freedom, which is how, I guess, it sort of sums up your kind of main view of how the war has affected us all globally as well.
Yeah.
Now, it's not something that I've thought about for continents such as Latin and South America, how the war affected them beyond, knowledge of the odd Nazi ending up in Argentina. How did the war affect Africa and South America, continents that we wouldn't necessarily think were directly affected by the war?
Yeah, well, as you say, I did want to stress the fact that it wasn't just a European war and an Asian war. It was a world war. The whole world was involved. So, I mean, there were Brazilians fighting in Italy, for example. So, there were people who were directly involved in the fighting who came from other places. But the greatest effects of the war in Latin America were kind of sort of social and political, really, and economic. Before the Second World War, most of the trade that went on between Latin America was with Europe. It had very strong trading ties, but of course those were broken by the Battle of the Atlantic. You couldn't send goods across very easily. So the patterns of trade changed, and they started doing much more north-south trade with the United States. And then any ships that went over to Europe were American ships. So America began to sort of control all the shipping. And so everything, instead of going directly from Latin America to Europe, was going up via the States. So they become much more reliant on the United States than they had been. And then you've got this sort of psychological thing. I mean, what's really interesting is that in Latin America, at the end of the war, suddenly there are all these democracy movements. Most countries had military dictators before and during the war, and then they all start to fall, and they've got sort of uprisings and people, democracy movements all across Latin America, and these are supported by the United States. Because they're full of the sort of ideals of the war, fight against the fascists, create democracy, let's do that. Then come 1949, when now there's a Cold War, suddenly democracy, well, it's okay as long as you're not too left wing, and suddenly there are all these sort of people with communist ideas in Latin America. So under the influence of the United States again, there's a clampdown, and suddenly all these dictators return, and countries that had become democratic then suddenly go back to being sort of military dictatorships again. So it's a really interesting time, and this is the effect that the war has on the whole region in a sort of psychological way that springs up all these democracy movements, and then as the Cold War kicks in, snuffs them out again.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, the polls think that some polls say the war didn't end until 1989, the fall of the war. I mean, it could be quite a compelling argument, really, when you consider, you've got USSR versus USA as a result of the war. You've got Vietnam and everything. You can completely see how the war really has affected everyone. And
yeah. I mean, North Korea and South Korea, they wouldn't have been like that if it hadn't been the Second World War. The Russians invaded from the north, and the Americans invaded from the south, and that's why we have a North and a South Korea. I mean, that's just a sort of obvious example, but there are examples like that across the world. It hits every single country, even places you wouldn't expect.
But there's an argument that. But I think this is more specific to our country and our glorifying of probably events during the war, in that, we are a little bit obsessed about World War II. We, everything, things are Churchillian. We want the Blitz spirit. Everyone talks about the dam busters. That side of things does get mentioned a lot, but I guess it speaks to a wider truth that World War II really was the most impactful event of, globally.
Well, I mean, what it did to the global economy it completely changed everything. It completely changed all the patterns of trade. It changed um, who got what. It changed, the British Empire collapsed. I mean, arguably, it was already going to be changing before the Second World War. But the Second World War did it. I mean, we couldn't afford an empire after that, and the same goes for France. Same goes the Dutch East Indies, which I also cover in The Fear and the Freedom. Now Indonesia. I mean, became independent as a direct consequence of World War II. Before that, it was always a Dutch colony. Even parts of Africa, as you mentioned in your earlier question, parts of Africa that were never directly involved in the war, there were people from those countries in places like Ghana, for example, or Nigeria, who fought in the British Army in places like Burma and picked up skills, which they then came back and thought, well, maybe we can use these. They also picked up ideas that they hadn't necessarily thought of before. Like, we're in India and the Indians are getting independence, so they know they're getting independence. Why don't we do the same thing? They've shown that it can be done. Why don't we do it? And so these ideas suddenly take off in Africa in a way which had only been very sort of beneath the surface before, when suddenly, because as a consequence of the war, became much more urgent.
Great stuff. Well, I think it's a nice way to end it with a sheer scale of the war. Now, I know you're working on a book on the war in Naples, or how Naples was affected by the war. Was that throughout the war, or are you going to? What are you covering?
I'm starting from 1943, when Naples was first of all occupied by the Germans when Italy swapped sides. Then the Neapolitans rose up against the Germans, kicked them out, and then the Allies turned up and reoccupied them in a sort of more benign way. Well, benign they thought, but actually that's when the whole economy of the city goes to pot, and people start starving, and women across the board start prostituting themselves in order to live, and so on. So it's a sort of tale of good intentions gone wrong.
Well, we've got a bit of time to wait till that's out, I think. But yeah. I wanted to ask you one more question, because I was doing a little bit of digging on your Amazon page, and I did notice that there's an early publication of yours called Tunnel Vision.
Oh yes. That brings back memories. Wow.
Right.
Yeah. In a previous life, I wrote a couple of novels. That was one of them.
But was that based? I should explain. Well, maybe you should explain the plot, and because I wanted to ask if it was grounded in reality in any way.
Okay. The plot was. This sort of it shows the sort of geeky side of my nature. I did a lot of research on the history of the tube and the sort of hidden aspects of the London Underground.
It sounds fantastic. I'm not taking the piss. I think it looks really good.
It's about a man who is about to get married, but his best friend, his supposed best friend, steals his honeymoon tickets, his wedding ring, his credit card, and various other things, and hides them in various places around the tube. And he's got 24 hours to go to every single tube station on the map, trying to find his stuff so he can get to his wedding on time and save the day. And of course, everything goes wrong along the way, and he falls out with his friend, and so on.
Have you ever tried to go to every station in a 24-hour
Yes,
period?
I have. And no, I didn't manage it. There are people who do this semi-professionally, and it's a real skill.
Right.
I didn't come close to managing to do it.
Yeah, you got to think of the right line to start on. And,
the right combination of where you get on and off trains, and how to organize your journey. And it's very complicated.
Well,
there's probably an algorithm out there, or there's probably an app for it now.
Yeah,
actually.
There probably is. Well, at least we've ended on a slightly more, positive, happier note.
Yeah.
Keith, thanks so much for your time. Those books are fantastic. I'm going to put links for them for the listeners to get to. And best of luck with the new book.
Thanks very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I always like talking to Keith because he raises those interesting questions of history. He covers parts of history that maybe not that many people do. And he also looks at the sort of murkier questions around World War II, which we don't often look into. So if you've got any comments, please give me feedback through the Apple Podcasts, or subscribe or follow, or whatever it is you do with your podcast platform that you use. And I thought I might read out. I might read out a comment if I've got time. It was very nice, so I read it and I was blown away. It was so kind. It was based on the story of Roger Morehouse gave us about the invasion of Poland in 1939. I got a nice message here. I loved listening to this tape, one we rarely hear about amongst the noise of the better-known battles and political intrigues. How did the Second World War even get to that point in the first place? Great to hear, and very much looking forward to hearing more new perspectives on other areas of history. So that's a lovely little comment there, all about my, not all about me, all about the chat I had with Roger Morehouse. So really it's all down to Roger, talking about the invasion of Poland in 1939. So today's podcast has been almost totally dominated by the Second World War. I hope you can forgive me. And next week we'll have a completely different subject. So, as ever, thank you very much for listening. Thank you, and good night.